The Ghost of Christmas Night. In the small town of Snowfall, lost among snowy plains, winters were particularly harsh. The main street was adorned with twinkling lights, and Christmas trees stood in every window, sparkling with colorful ornaments. This year, Lizzie McGuire, a young elementary school teacher, decided to stay in town instead of visiting her family. She hoped to spend a peaceful Christmas Eve alone. The house Lizzie rented an apartment in was an old Victorian mansion. Its creaky wooden floors and heavy curtains added a grim charm to the atmosphere. In the evening, she lit candles, poured herself a glass of wine, and settled on the couch with a book. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Lizzie looked up. She wasn't expecting visitors. Opening the door, she saw a boy of about 10, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat. His face was pale, and his eyes shone with a strange light. "Mom," he said in a quiet voice, "have you seen my brother?" "Your brother?" Lizzie asked, staring at him in surprise. "No, sorry, you must have the wrong house." The boy said nothing, nodded sadly, and disappeared into the snowy darkness. Lizzie felt a slight unease but convinced herself it was just a neighbor's child. An hour later, as she immersed herself in her book again, a shadow flickered past the window. Her heart pounded. She cautiously approached the window and peered out. No one. Only the snowstorm grew stronger, and the tree branches bent under the weight of the ice. Lizzie closed the curtains and decided to go to bed. But just as she reached the bedroom, a strange sound echoed through the house, as if someone was walking slowly down the hallway. Her breathing quickened. Grabbing a flashlight, she followed the sound. The beam of the flashlight illuminated the long hallway, which seemed even longer. And there, at the very end, stood a figure. "Who's there?" Lizzie shouted, barely concealing her panic. The figure vanished, as if dissolved into the air. Lizzie rushed back to her bedroom and locked the door. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but the signal was gone. That night she barely slept, and in the morning, everything looked as if nothing had happened. She tried to convince herself it was just a bad dream. But when Lizzie went down to the kitchen, she found a small, old doll on the table. She didn't remember seeing it before. On the doll was written, "Merry Christmas, Lizzie." Terrified, she ran out of the house and headed to the local library to learn more about the mansion's past. The librarian, an old woman named Mary, turned noticeably pale when Lizzie asked her about it. "You don't know," Mary whispered. "That house once belonged to the Carlisle family. Their youngest son went missing on Christmas Eve exactly 50 years ago. They say his spirit still wanders, looking for his brother." Lizzie felt a chill run down her spine. She returned home, determined to find a way out of the situation. But when she entered, the house seemed darker than before. And now whispers came from right behind her. "Did you see my brother?" Her scream shattered the silence. Later, neighbors would say they heard something creaking and breaking in the house that night, but no one dared enter. By morning, Lizzie McGuire was never seen again. The house still stands in Snowfall. They say on Christmas Eve, you can see the glowing silhouette of a boy in an old-fashioned hat in its windows, still searching for his brother. The Christmas Call. Meredith Hall hated Christmas. Ever since her husband died in a car accident exactly 2 years ago, the holiday reminded her only of pain and loss. She had left the city and moved into an old country house, far from the festive chaos. Her only companions were silence and the cold. On Christmas Eve, Meredith sat in her kitchen with a glass of red wine. Outside, snow whirled, blanketing the surroundings in a thick white sheet. The house was deathly quiet, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fireplace. Suddenly, the silence was interrupted by the shrill ring of the phone. Meredith flinched. She rarely used the old landline. Mobile phones were much more convenient. Reluctantly, she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" There was no answer, only faint breathing. "Who is this?" she asked, frowning. The breathing stopped, and the call disconnected. Annoyed, Meredith hung up, convincing herself it was a prank. But 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling this time. A whisper came from the other end, so quiet she could barely make out the words. "Do you remember me?" Meredith's face went pale. The voice was familiar. It was her late husband's voice. "Who is this? Is this some kind of joke?" she shouted, but the whisper continued, ignoring her outburst. "Why did you leave me? Don't you remember what you promised?" Meredith's heart raced. Guilt over her husband's death had haunted her ever since. She was supposed to be in the car with him that fateful day but had stayed late at work. The house grew unbearably quiet. Even the fireplace seemed to have gone out, as if the fire itself was afraid. Meredith began to feel like someone was watching her. Her eyes fell on an old mirror in the hallway. She was certain something had just moved in its reflection. Gathering her courage, she walked toward the mirror. Her reflection seemed odd, slightly blurred. She reached out to touch the glass, but the moment her fingers grazed it, the mirror trembled, and a voice echoed from its depths. "You promised never to leave me." Meredith screamed and jumped back. At that moment, the lights in the house flickered, and the phone rang a third time. This time, the ringing was relentless, as if demanding her attention. Her hands shaking, she picked up the receiver. "What do you want?" she shouted. The answer was short and chilling. "I'm here." The phone slipped from her grasp. Just then, a dull knock came from the door. Meredith froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Outside, the snowstorm raged, as if nature itself was trying to warn her. Meredith approached the door and with trembling hands cracked it open. There was no one there, only fresh tracks in the snow leading to the house. They weren't human. The prints resembled something long and skeletal like claw marks. She slammed the door shut and began barricading it with furniture. But before she could finish, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. She heard the floorboards creak behind her. Turning around, she saw nothing. Only the cold filled the air. "You'll never leave me," a voice whispered directly behind her. She turned, but there was only darkness. Suddenly, her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. From the mirror in the hallway, a figure began to emerge. It was her husband, but his face was distorted, and his eyes glowed with an icy light. "You promised," he said, reaching out to her. Meredith screamed, unable to move. The world around her dissolved into a dark haze. The last thing she saw was his twisted smile. The next day, neighbors found Meredith's house empty. The only thing left was the phone, dangling off the hook, and a message scratched onto the frosted window. "I kept my promise." The Devil's Sleigh. In a small village in northern Norway, Christmas was steeped in tradition. Every household placed their sleigh outside, adorned with candles and wreaths. It was said this gesture welcomed the holiday spirit, bringing luck and protection from evil forces. But in the Ostrom family, the tradition was ignored. Liv Ostrom, a young widow with her 7-year-old daughter Ingrid, had only recently moved to the village after her husband's death. She dismissed the old customs as superstitious nonsense. On Christmas Eve, while all the neighbors had their sleighs beautifully decorated and glowing, her yard remained dark and bare. Ingrid watched wistfully from the window, gazing at the warm lights and cheerful decorations. "Mom, why don't we decorate a sleigh too?" she asked. "They're so pretty." "It's just superstition," Liv said, pulling the curtains closed. "We don't need it." Later that night, as Liv went to bed, Ingrid stayed by the window. Her attention was drawn to shadows flitting through the moonlit snow. It looked like someone was moving among the neighbors' sleighs. Ingrid squinted, trying to see more clearly. The figures looked human, but their limbs were unnaturally long and thin. They crouched by the sleighs, as if inspecting them, then moved on to the next. Terrified, Ingrid ran to her mother. "Mom, there's someone outside," she whispered urgently. Liv, exhausted from the day, reluctantly got out of bed and looked out the window. She saw nothing but the still snow-covered yard. "It's just your imagination," she said. "Go back to bed." But Liv's sleep didn't last long. She was startled awake by a strange noise outside, like something heavy being dragged through the snow. She went to the window and saw tracks leading directly to their house. The wind howled, swirling snow into eerie patterns, and an uneasy feeling crept over her. Then came the knock, soft at first, then louder. Liv hesitated. She approached the door but stopped short when she heard a whisper, "You didn't welcome us." Her heart pounded. She knew no one should be there. She decided not to open the door, but when she returned to her bedroom, Ingrid's bed was empty. Panicking, she ran back to the window and saw strange figures disappearing into the storm, pushing a large black sleigh. In the sleigh sat a small figure. It was Ingrid. Liv threw on her coat and ran out into the freezing night, screaming for them to stop. The figures didn't react, vanishing into the forest. Desperate, she followed their tracks, ignoring the cold and exhaustion. The trail seemed endless, and the deeper she went, the darker the night became. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing where the sleigh stood, glowing with a spectral light. The figures moved around it, their faces hidden under dark hoods. Liv could see Ingrid sitting in the sleigh, her eyes closed as if in a trance. "Leave her alone," Liv cried. "Take me instead." One of the figures turned toward her, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface like ice. It raised a bony finger and pointed at her. "You broke the tradition. The sleigh is ours now, but if you wish to save her, offer a replacement." Liv trembled, frozen with fear. She knew these beings weren't human. Summoning all her courage, she shouted, "Take me. Just let her go." The figures surrounded her, their icy presence overwhelming. Liv felt the cold seep into her very soul as darkness consumed her. When she woke, she was lying in the snow outside her house. Ingrid was asleep on the porch, clutching a small wooden sleigh carved from dark wood. From that day on, the villagers often spoke of a shadowy figure wandering the forest, searching for something it had lost. And no one dared live in Liv Ostrom's house. For every Christmas Eve, whispers could be heard on the wind, "You didn't welcome us." Thank you all so much for helping us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to me, and I promise to keep bringing you even more chilling stories. The next goal is 5,000 subscribers, and with your help, I know we can make it happen. If you enjoyed these tales of Christmas terror, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing which story scared you the most. Your feedback keeps the chills coming. Stay tuned for more horrifying stories, and as always, thanks for being part of our growing horror community. See you in the next video.